So, hey everyone. Today I'm going to talk about what I look for in a book. The kind of things that will attract me to pick one title over the other. And, I think that, I guess at this point, a couple of months ago, or however long ago by the point this airs, I did a video of things that caused me to lose interest. Well, this is sort of a little bit of the other side of the coin. What causes me to look at your book online, in person, wherever, and think, this is something I'd like to check out. And, for me, I have some particular requirements that, if this is what you're writing, because, write whatever it is in your heart to write. But if this is what you write and you think that it fits the criteria of the things that I look for, this is definitely one of those things that usually gives you a leg up in terms of the overall competition, for material media out there, things that you think that I would like, things that I will read and happily give you a review for, especially if you do a good job. And the first thing is that I like to focus on three specific genres that are the bulk of what I read. Now, I want to say that this is not necessarily the only things that I will read, because occasionally I do read other things for interest, for curiosity, or just for whatever reason, variety sometimes. But the primary focus of my reading list is usually one of three things. It's either sci-fi, fantasy, or furry. And no doubt you've noticed that in a lot of the reviews that I've put out so far, because they're all either Star Trek books, which has been a love of mine since I was 5. Fantasy series, I like a lot of those. And of course, furry material, having been in the furry fandom for a long time, as well as being a producer of content myself, which is coming for in the near future. I'd also like to say that those are the things I primarily enjoy reading as well as writing, and they're things that catch my attention. So, if you're writing sci-fi, if you're writing fantasy, if you're writing furry, and of course furry can also be fantasy or sci-fi, higher points for you if that is true, because I do like sci-fi and fantasy that is furry. But of course I also kind of like furry because a lot of the books I read are genres that, if they had been a non-furry book, I never would have picked them up. So, but usually as long as you're one of those three things, you have my attention. Now, I try and gauge, as I think most people do, you look at the cover, you read the back jacket, and you try and get a sense of what this book has to offer. And for the most part, usually I can tell by the first 100 pages if this book has these things or not. And it's not necessarily that any of these things not being present are a deal breaker, but it's certainly something that, again, I look for when I'm trying to select my next reading material. And one of the things that is on that list is universes that work. I like to see the nuts and bolts, that the author has thought about it, that this universe has been constructed, that the story was built with the mechanics in mind. Now, what I mean by that is that you can see a universe that functions, a universe that works, that the pieces fit, that everything makes sense, that all of this thing comes from somewhere, even if it's never revealed in the story, that you as the author have written it in mind to know that these things are the case. For example, let's talk about I know that there's try to remember what it was called, but it was a trilogy by Brian Sanderson where there was a magic set that had, or an ability set that had 8 different types. You could either push or pull certain metals, you could do certain things with them, but there were 8 categories, and there was only one type of person that could do all 8. And the thing that really made this work for me is that I like magic systems with rules, with, limitations to what you can do, because it makes the story stronger, in my opinion, if you can't just Deus Ex Machina your way out of any situation. Because that's why I don't like the Harry Potter series, and this has nothing to do with J.K. Rowling, although I'm not a fan of her myself. But that aside, the first problem that I had with Harry Potter, before I knew anything about her politics or any of that stuff, the problem that I had with the series was that magic was limitless. There was no stop or start as far as what couldn't magic do. What consequences were there if you broke it? Does magic have a range limit? Does it have a consequence? Do people run out of magic? It's like, can you use up all your MP? But the problem is that Harry Potter, and I know it's a children's book, but I don't care. That still applies. They didn't actually ever specify any of the things that would have made it interesting to me. Like, what do you do in a situation where magic doesn't work? What happens if you run out of magic? It's like, if your wand breaks, do you have to resort to something else? And it was just like, these questions were never answered in the story. And this was just the things that would have excited me to show that this universe could be a functional world. And I don't think Harry Potter really qualifies as a functional world, because there's a lot of things in it that just don't ever get explained to the point that they line up. And again, it's magic and it's children's books, but I don't qualify that as an acceptable excuse, because I see the Avatar universe, and it's like, it's a universe with rules that works, that fits together very well. It's like, you see all these pieces about how there's the four nations: earth, fire, wind, and water, and all of them kind of have their own ways, their own parts of the world, their own categories. And a lot of people can do these bending abilities. And true, nobody may actually run out of bending that I know of, but there are ways to take bending away from people. There are people with different abilities. There are limitations to what they can do with it. And I mean, overall, it works as a very logical universe that fits together, that has rules, conventions, and things that just make sense. And this is the kind of thing that I look for. It's like, like I think I've said before, with developing your story, it's like, decisions that you make have ripples, and they also have to line up. It's just, if you have an empire in control of your story, how did that empire rise? How long has it been there? What are their capabilities? These sorts of things. That if you create magic, what are the rules? It's like, I want to know the rules. I want to know what makes somebody a master. What makes somebody have this power and not another? What are their limitations? What do they do if it runs out? All these sorts of nuts and bolts. It's like, the Winterfall project that I'm working on. It's I had in the beginning, I was inspired by a couple of stories, and although they kind of answered it in their story, I kind of also wanted to answer it in mine, as far as how did we get to here, because I always like to go backwards and figure out how things got to where they are, about why things work the way that they do, and also to establish logical rules that follow from what you've already put down. So, the nuts and bolts are important to me. It's like, if I see your universe and it does not explain the parts that I need to know in order to make sense of all this, that is something that will dissuade me from reading one book. But if you're doing this, it makes me interested in yours. Because, I've read a lot of books where there are genetically engineered species, and there are a lot of caveats that come with a genetically engineered species that typically seem to get ignored in a lot of the furry fiction that I've read. And that, to me, strikes me as the fact that the author, rather than was more interested in wish fulfillment rather than actually following the logistics that would have made this a better story. Problem with genetic engineering is that your populations are usually limited to a certain number. You can't, have populations that are, beyond a certain range. That usually they lack. If the species is genetically engineered, what about medical care? How are the medical resources available? It's like, how many, are they viable species on their own? What does that mean? How long ago did it happen? If they were, what were they designed for? It's like, these things matter, because if they were designed for like servitude or being a soldier or something, this means that there are going to be some that accept that, some that don't. There will be some that, maybe are interested in being, having choices, having their control over their own lives. And all that kind of stuff matters and makes for good stories, for me. Like, people that when there's genetic engineering with these characters that just fit into this role in this universe, and they just accept it, it seems to me like, if there's not at least some that defy that, it is illogical to what I know of people in general. And that runs counter to a good story. Because let's say that you were designed to pick up trash and that's all you were designed to do. Well, most people I don't think would really voluntarily choose that. Most people I don't think would necessarily want to. It's essential and it's perhaps necessary in a society, but the key thing that I want to focus on here is that if you were forced to do this, you were never given an option. If you could never be anything more than that, at least by the rules of society, what would that mean for you? It's like, and the fact that the author has thought about these sorts of things is important. Moving on, the next thing I really like to see is realistic behavior from characters. And this kind of dovetails into the stuff that makes me lose interest because whatever you design your character to be, their skill set, their knowledge, their reactions have to be in tune with that. It's like if your character is a soldier, they would have the military training, they would be good at combat, they would probably know a lot about the ins and outs of tactical strategy, things like that. But if your character is like a private detective, they're going to have skills of investigation, they're going to notice things that other people wouldn't. There'll be a lot of things that they would do, depending on what their family situation is. It's like, is your private detective married? Does he have a kid? How does that factor into things? And whatever you assign them, it usually comes with, and some of this is controllable by you, the author, as far as like, say, you can have a PI that has a good relationship with his kid versus a PI that hasn't seen their daughter in 14 years. But either of these things results in a certain pattern of behavior from most people. And again, I'm using most people as a generalization because your story is going to be specific. So it's like if you have a private detective who's like, he doesn't get along with his wife, and as a result, he never sees his daughter who he really loves, that's going to affect him, and that's going to cause some of his decisions and some of his behaviors. And what your character must do has to be in tune with that. If he does something that doesn't line up with that, with what you've established as and part of this is instinct, part of this is experience, but characters usually they do, I guess, whatever we're all victims of our own personalities. Like, we're going to do what we're going to do, what we've always traditionally done, unless there's a reason to change it. So that if you need them to do something that they wouldn't normally do, there has to be a really good reason, a really logical reason that fits into this character's persona. It's like, say that normally you have a law-abiding citizen who would never break a law. Well, somebody kidnaps their child and holds them hostage and wants them to commit a bank robbery. Well, now they're going to commit a bank robbery because they have their daughter as leverage, and they never would have done this normally. But as a result of which, this means that they're not necessarily going to be prepared for what they have to do, that they're going to be in over their head. They might need to consult people that they wouldn't normally talk to. They would have a lot of problems that they wouldn't run into. And how they react realistically to these situations is important. It's like maybe, as a result of their character's stubborn personality, they would initially refuse or something. Or maybe they would just try and find a way to resist their captor's control, even though they know that they can't. But, these things matter. And that's important to me. If I see that, if I see your character behaving realistically to whatever parameters you've established, that's always something that catches my attention because I watch for that and I like that. Good dialogue is important. I like the dialogue between characters to sound realistic, that if two characters have a conversation that it flows well, that their personality comes through in the way that they speak and what they say and various things that they do. And I know sometimes that with my cast, it's always kind of like, how can you establish a verbal identity for them? And it really does make a difference. If you have a character that, talks a certain way, you can throw in like expressions that they use, or, they may phrase things a certain way. And of course, I always advise reading over your paragraphs to make sure that the dialogue flows. And in a lot of cases, if you do this, it works out to be, better dialogue because you avoid repetitious things that will make the reader just pause and stop and examine things for a second, because you don't want them to stop. You want the flow to be continuous for your reader. And, in a case, I have to cite a recent example that I read, Squirrel Girl Universe. that dialogue was fantastic. The book was funny, the characters were witty, all of them had distinct personalities, and it was a what I would consider to be almost a masterclass in dialogue. Very smooth, very funny, very flowy, and all the characters, you could get a clear hint of who each character was from how they talked, from what they said, and things of that nature, as is how it should be. And that's one of the reasons why I like that book so well, because it had all of the things that I'm talking about. You know, it was sci-fi, it was a little furry, I guess, because of Squirrel Girl, had a universe that worked, which, you know, has been well established with the Marvel universe. Characters behaved realistically for who and what they were. Dialogue was good, and of course, the last thing, and this is a big one. This is a big one for me. Um, and it's kind of hard, I guess, to put this into exact words, but let's just say that I like your book to surprise me at least once. And what I mean by that is that not necessarily like a twist ending or something, but just a little bit of a surprise in that whatever you might expect your reader to pick up on, there's at least one thing that comes out during the course of the book, in dialogue and plot, in any other sense, that basically just is something that the reader will come up across and be like, I did not see that coming. Because although I like a certain amount of criteria, and it's hard to say, how exactly how this works, but I like to read stories. I like to see stories in which there are things to figure out, things to determine, and if you as a reader can come to these conclusions with the information provided, that usually gives me like a huge high that I can't really get too many other ways. And, I'm going to give you a movie example because this was something that was so well hidden that I just did not see until the last moment. Because, it's like, I don't know if any of you have seen the Saw films, but I'm going to talk about Saw 2 for a minute. Because when I watched Saw 2, it was the first one I had ever seen, so I had never seen the series, and I was watching this movie, and it had my brain working because I was watching it carefully. And right towards the end of the movie, and I've talked about this with my partner a few times, they break into the building where they think the victims are being held, and the detective says something that triggered a thought in my head, and she said, I can't see you on the footage. So I paused it, and all of a sudden, I had a revelation. I realized that the footage that they'd been watching for the entire length of the movie was not live footage. And I apologize if this is a spoiler for anybody, but the movie's been out for like 18 years, so at this point I kind of think you would have seen it. But anyway, I can't really discuss the revelation without discussing the ending, so I apologize if I've spoiled it for you. But that was the thing that blew my mind, because all of a sudden I realized that everything that I thought was true wasn't true. Because now we realize that the footage that we've been watching, which we thought was a live feed, is not. It was pre-recorded. It had happened sometime before the parts of the story that we're seeing with the police. Like, between the point that his son had gone missing and now, this had all already gone down. And we just didn't know that until we see the moment where we realized that the video was pre-recorded for them, and they assumed it was live, and you as the audience are meant to assume that. Because once you realize that this has already happened, then all of a sudden, so many new possibilities open up to you. And this is what I like to see in my media, in my TV shows, in my books. It's like all of a sudden, the misdirection is a very important skill that I think as a writer, as a television story writer, that this all needs to be one of those tools that you know how to use and know how to use well. And one of the things that I think is really important is being able to do that. Use misdirection to just have these revelations that just all of a sudden open up all of these possibilities. And this only works with the other four things. Because if all of those things line up, then it just blows your mind in a way, or at least it does with me, in a way that I just can't describe. It's like figuring something out in the story and then finding out that you were right. And it all makes sense. And it is the top experience in my mind. It's just, that is just what blows my mind. And, you know, it's like, I remember seeing it in it's like in Kjellgold's first book, Volley, you know, and it's like if you haven't read this book, I suggest you do. It's his first book, and some people have said it shows, but it's like Kjellgold, his worst book is better than a lot of folks' best books on their best day. So he's usually a good bet to start with good fiction because the man knows how to write a story. And you know, I will say that the ending had a surprise which blew my mind, you know, very well. And I have to say that it's a hell of a thing when you're reading a book and you think you know what's going on, and then you just all of a sudden get this sucker punch that you just didn't see coming, that it changes everything. And if you can do that, that usually is one of those reasons that will get me to talk about your book a lot. So, you know, as far as what do I look for in a book, to summarize, you know, those 5 things. If it's sci-fi, furry, and fantasy, you've got my attention. If I know how your universe works, if it matters and works into your story, that's a big thing too. I like to see your characters having realistic behavior for who and what they are, you know, in terms of every category. It's like species, job, you know, personality, whatever their situation is. It's like these things are important. The dialogue has to be good. It's like you have to be good at having characters talk to each other about how people talk. And also, you know, a surprise somewhere in the story. It doesn't have to be at the end, it doesn't have to be in the middle, but something during the run of your book that changes things even a little, and it just all of a sudden just makes everything open up. But, you know, if you're looking for what I look for, if your book has these things, suggest it to me and I will give it a read and I will give it a review, and you will definitely hear about it from me. So, you know, those are the things that I really look for when I'm looking for reading materials. Like that's, you know, what you'll see in my book reviews. That's what you'll see my interest in. It's like if you have these 3 categories, if you have those 5 points, you have a book that I will like. Well, that's my video, and thank you everyone for watching. If you like werewolves, check out my book Blue Moon, available in paperback and ebook on Amazon. Thanks for watching. If you liked it, click the subscribe button and leave a comment below. Catch you later.